I stood at the edge of the stone hall, my pale blonde braids marking me as wrong in a room full of dark-haired, pure-blood wolves. Whispers followed me like smoke, curling around my ears with familiar cruelty. Half-breed. Thornwood's last mistake. Should have died with her pack. I was here only because ancient law required pack representation, even for packs reduced to one survivor nobody wanted. My fingers traced the carved pillar beside me, seeking something solid, while everything else felt like quicksand threatening to pull me under. Then Alpha King Oliver Ryan entered through the torchlit archway, and the hall fell into reverent silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Everyone saw the legendary warrior whose reputation alone made the strongest alphas bow their heads in submission. I saw something else, power wrapped around loneliness so profound it called to the same hollow ache I carried in my chest. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, his leather armor bore marks of recent battle, and his eyes swept the room with the cold assessment of someone who'd learned to trust no one. The ceremonial gathering began, voices rising in formal greetings that excluded me as easily as breathing. I tried to make myself smaller, more invisible, the way I'd perfected over months of surviving spaces that didn't want me. That's when Oliver's gaze locked onto me with alarming intensity, cutting through the crowd like he'd known exactly where I stood all along. Panic seized my chest. What had I done wrong? Had I violated some protocol I didn't know existed? He crossed the hall with predatory purpose, wolves parting for him instinctively, and every instinct in me screamed to run, to hide, to disappear before whatever judgment he'd decided to deliver. Before I could move, his hand closed around my waist, pulling me against leather armor and solid warmth with enough force to steal my breath. His other hand cupped the back of my head, angling my face toward his, and his lips brushed my ear as he whispered words that made my world tilt sideways. "You're in danger. Pretend I'm your husband." Then louder, for the entire hall to hear, his voice carrying absolute authority. "There you are, my chosen mate. I've been looking for you." The ancient bonding phrase, spoken publicly, legally binding. Behind us, I heard the soft scrape of steel being drawn from concealment, and everything exploded into chaos. Oliver's hand tightened on my waist so suddenly that the breath snagged in my throat. One heartbeat I was frozen in confusion. The next he spun us with fluid violence, turning his body fully between me and the open space I'd been occupying moments before. The hall tilted, torches blurring into streaks of gold as he moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible. I didn't understand why until steel flashed in my peripheral vision and the first assassin stepped out of the shadows where columns cast deep pools of darkness. There were 3 of them. My mind counted automatically even as terror flooded my system, turning my limbs to stone. One on the left, one directly ahead, one flanking right, all moving with identical precision, their weapons no longer concealed but raised and ready. Their eyes were flat, focused, tracking not Oliver as I would have expected, but the flagstones where I'd been standing a breath ago. They'd been hunting me, not the king. Me. Down. Oliver's command cracked through the air, not shouted but layered with authority that bypassed thought and hit instinct directly. My knees folded before I could process the word. I dropped, skirt pooling around me, palms scraping cold stone as I made myself as small as possible behind the wall of his body. Oliver moved like violence given shape. He surged forward, intercepting the first assassin before the man could adjust his aim. Steel rang against steel, sparks spitting in the space between them, and the sound jolted the hall out of its ceremonial stillness. Gasps erupted around us. Chairs scraped back. Crystal goblets shattered against stone, spilling wine that looked too much like blood. The second assassin lunged from the right, going not for Oliver but for the line of nobles frozen behind him. A calculated move forced the king to choose between his own survival and theirs. Oliver didn't hesitate. He pivoted, catching the man's wrist mid-strike, twisting with brutal efficiency that made my stomach clench. Bones snapped with a sound I felt in my teeth. The dagger clattered across stone, spinning until it stopped against my boot. I stared at it, stupidly fascinated by how small it looked for something designed to end lives. The third assassin realized in that moment that the plan had failed. I saw it in the way his shoulders tensed, in the fraction of a beat where his eyes flicked from Oliver to the nearest exit. He didn't make it. Oliver used the momentum of the second man's fall to launch himself forward, crossing the distance like the space didn't exist. His hand slammed into the assassin's chest, driving him back into a pillar hard enough that dust rained from carved stone above. Around us, the hall dissolved into chaos. Some alphas shifted partially, claws extending and eyes flashing gold as they dragged their own packs into defensive formations. Others shoved their mates behind them, forming protective circles. The scent of fear and adrenaline thickened the air until breathing felt like drowning. Through it all, Oliver never stepped far enough away that I wasn't within his reach, even as he struck, blocked, ended lives with clinical efficiency. There was a constant awareness in his movement, a subtle angling that kept himself positioned between me and every threat. I realized with dizzying clarity that if he hadn't moved when he did, those assassins would have killed me before anyone understood what was happening. Silence crashed down like a physical weight. One moment there was screaming, clanging steel, frantic footsteps. The next, only ragged breathing and the faint drip of spilled wine edging toward floor drains. 3 bodies lay motionless on flagstones, limbs at unnatural angles. The nearest was close enough that I could see unfamiliar symbols tattooed along his wrist. Oliver turned back to me, and for the first time since his hand had closed around my waist, I saw his face fully. His expression was carved in ice, controlled and cold, but his hands betrayed him, fingers flexing once, twice, as if they hadn't decided whether to keep killing or start shaking. He crossed to me in 3 strides and offered his hand. "Are you hurt?" The question came out rough, dragged over gravel. Up close, his eyes were darker than I'd realized, almost black, ringed with a thin line of gold that flared as his gaze swept over me, checking for wounds I was too numb to feel. I opened my mouth. No sound emerged. My body had forgotten how to coordinate breath and speech, and thought into something coherent. Oliver's jaw tightened. He hauled me to my feet with surprising gentleness given the violence still coating his hands, steadying me when my legs threatened to buckle. His palm burned against mine, grounding me in sensation when everything else felt unreal. "Marcus," he said, without taking his eyes off me, his voice carrying absolute authority despite the chaos still rippling through the hall. "Get her to my chambers. No one enters without my explicit permission. No one." A man appeared at my elbow, tall, with sandy hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His hand closed around my arm, not unkindly, guiding me toward a side entrance while my mind struggled to process what had just happened. As Marcus escorted me away, I heard Oliver's voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade, cold and absolute. "Someone just tried to assassinate my mate. I want answers. Now." The word mate echoed in my ears long after the doors closed behind us, sealing me away from the hall and the king and the bodies of wolves who'd been sent to kill me for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. I woke to silk against my skin, a sensation so foreign that for a heartbeat I thought I was dreaming. But dreams didn't come with the scent of cedar smoke or the weight of blankets embroidered with symbols I didn't recognize. I blinked against darkness, and the room assembled itself in pieces, carved furniture older than my bloodline, floor-to-ceiling windows framing mountains painted silver by moonlight, tapestries depicting wolves mid-hunt with eyes that glittered with metallic thread. This wasn't my room. This wasn't even a room someone like me should be allowed to breathe in. Movement pulled my attention to the chair beside the fireplace. Oliver sat there, utterly still except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. He was still wearing his armor, leather darkened in places I didn't want to examine too closely. Blood, his or theirs, I couldn't tell. His dark hair fell loose around his face now, and shadows carved hollows beneath his eyes that made him look older, worn down by years of carrying impossible weight. He was watching me with the kind of focus that made my pulse stutter and my wolf press low in instinctive submission. Those eyes were unreadable. Dark pools reflecting firelight but revealing nothing of what moved beneath. Why? The word escaped before I could cage it, raw and small in the quiet. My voice cracked halfway through, and I hated how it exposed everything I was trying to hold together. Why did those assassins target me? Why did you save me? Why did you claim me as your mate? The questions tumbled out in a rush, each one heavier than the last, until I was sitting up clutching silk sheets to my chest like they could shield me from answers I wasn't sure I wanted. Oliver stood, the movement fluid and predatory. He crossed the distance with measured steps, each one deliberate, giving me time to retreat if I wanted. I didn't move. Couldn't. My wolf was whimpering somewhere deep inside, caught between the instinct to bare her throat in submission and the sharp, unfamiliar pull toward the power radiating from him. He stopped at the edge of the bed, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to hold his gaze. "You don't know," he said slowly, the words shaped with something close to disbelief. His eyes moved over my face, searching, reading every flicker of confusion and fear I couldn't hide. "You genuinely have no idea why someone wants you dead." "I'm nobody," I whispered, the confession tasting like ash. The last member of a fallen pack, half human and worthless. Who would waste 3 trained assassins on someone like me? The words came easier now, old and familiar, the litany I'd repeated to myself every time someone turned away, every time whispers followed my braids like accusations. Something flickered in his expression, recognition, maybe, or pain. He knew how to hide, but not quickly enough. His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he'd argue, tell me I was wrong. Instead, he said, "You're not worthless." So quietly I almost missed it beneath the fire's crackle. Then louder, "And someone clearly thinks you're dangerous enough to eliminate. That's not nothing, Deborah." He moved to the window, putting distance between us, and I realized he was giving me space to breathe without the weight of his presence pressing down on every instinct. "The phrase I used," he said, staring at mountains instead of me, "the one where I claimed you publicly, it invoked an ancient bonding law, spoken before witnesses. It's legally binding." He turned, firelight catching the sharp lines of his face. "You're my mate now, in the eyes of every pack represented at that council. Which means you're under absolute royal protection." The implications hit me like cold water. "I trapped you," I said, horror flooding through me so fast it stole my breath. "You saved my life, and I trapped you into a bond you never wanted with someone you—" I knew exactly what I was doing. His interruption was sharp, final, cutting through my spiral. He crossed back to me in 3 strides, his hand catching my chin and tilting my face up with gentleness that didn't match the steel in his voice. "I've lived long enough to know the weight of every word I speak, Deborah. I don't make mistakes like that." His thumb brushed my jaw, a touch so brief I might have imagined it. "The question we need to answer," he said, his eyes boring into mine with intensity that made it impossible to look away, "is why someone wants you dead badly enough to risk assassinating you at the Lunar Council, in front of 200 witnesses, knowing it would start a war if they succeeded." I tried to think past the panic, past the feel of his hand still cradling my face, like I was something fragile instead of broken. "I don't know anything important," I said helplessly. "I don't have secrets, or power, or—" "Then we find out what you have that they're afraid of," Oliver said. And there was something cold and dangerous in his voice now that reminded me he wasn't just a king. He was a weapon, honed by years of survival, and right now that weapon was aimed at whoever had dared threaten what he'd claimed as his. Even if I didn't understand why he'd claimed me at all. The emergency council session was called before dawn, which told me everything I needed to know about how badly the purebloods wanted this resolved. A servant had woken me with cold efficiency, providing formal robes in deep blue colors marking me as claimed by the royal house, whether I wanted them or not. My hands shook as I braided my hair, the pale blonde strands feeling more like a brand than ever. Marcus escorted me through corridors that grew progressively grander until we reached double doors carved with wolves in eternal chase. "Stay close to the king," he murmured before pushing them open. "Don't let them see you afraid." The council chamber was built to intimidate. Circular, with tiered seating rising toward a domed ceiling painted with constellations I didn't recognize. Every seat was filled with pure-blood alphas, whose eyes tracked my entrance with expressions ranging from disgust to calculating interest. At the center, positioned where everyone could see, sat 2 thrones. Oliver occupied the larger one, his presence filling the space despite his stillness. He gestured to the smaller throne beside him, not a chair for advisors or witnesses, but the queen's seat, carved with feminine wolves and ancient symbols of protection. My feet stopped moving. That seat had held queens for centuries. Pure blood, powerful women who'd shaped kingdoms. I was a half-breed Omega from a fallen pack. "Deborah." Oliver's voice carried quiet command. "Sit." I moved on legs that felt disconnected from my body, hyper-aware of every eye following my path to that throne. The stone was cold beneath me, even through layers of formal robes. Oliver's hand found mine on the armrest, his fingers intertwining with shocking intimacy given the public setting. The touch anchored me, reminded me to breathe. Lady Morgana stood from her seat in the first tier, her crimson dress catching light like fresh blood. She was beautiful in the way predators were beautiful, all clean lines and deadly grace, her dark hair swept back to expose alpha markings along her throat. When she spoke, her voice carried that particular poison wrapped in silk and courtesy. "Our king has bonded with a half-breed Omega," she said, letting the words spread through assembled wolves like rot through timber, contaminating the royal bloodline in a moment of misguided heroism. Murmurs of agreement rippled outward, alphas nodding with expressions that made my stomach clench. I felt Oliver's hand tighten fractionally on mine, the only sign of tension in his otherwise controlled exterior. "The bonding was legal," Oliver said, his voice cold enough to frost the air. Witnessed by 200 wolves and sanctioned by ancient law. Unless you're suggesting our ancestors were fools when they wrote those laws? Winda Stopman and definitely say that of one and on. Morgana's smile didn't reach her eyes. Legal, perhaps, but unconscionable, she countered smoothly, turning so her words could reach every corner. You can annul it, my king. Claim you were manipulated by a desperate Omega using dark magic to trap herself a king. Her gaze slid to me, dismissive and cruel. We've all heard stories of half-breeds who learn forbidden arts from their human blood. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Dark magic, manipulation. Every wolf in this chamber now had permission to believe I'd seduced their king through unnatural means. We're offering you a way out, Morgana continued, her tone gentling as if explaining something to a child. Annul the bonding. Execute the half-breed for forbidden magic. Restore proper order to the bloodline. Silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. I forced myself to keep breathing, to not let them see how her words carved into wounds I'd spent months trying to heal. Oliver's thumb traced circles on the back of my hand, a gesture so small and unconscious I wasn't sure he realized he was doing it. Are you suggesting, Oliver said slowly, each word precisely shaped, that I'm weak-minded enough to be manipulated by an Omega with no training, no pack backing, and no reason to target me specifically? His alpha presence leaked into the air, subtle but undeniable. I felt it press against my skin, felt wolves throughout the chamber shift uncomfortably as their own wolves responded to dominance that reminded them exactly who ruled here. Morgana hesitated, but recovered quickly. I'm suggesting you acted on protective instinct, without considering consequences, she said. It's admirable, truly, but protection doesn't require bonding. Choose your next word carefully, Oliver interrupted, and something in his voice made the hair on my neck stand up. Morgana's jaw tightened. Without complicating the succession, she finished. Your heirs will carry half-human blood now. Other packs may refuse to recognize them. She wasn't wrong, and we all knew it. I could see the calculation in eyes watching us. Alphas weighing whether Oliver's decision was strength or the first crack in foundations they'd built their power on. Oliver stood, and the movement pulled every gaze to him. He released my hand but stepped closer to my throne, positioning himself slightly in front of me in a gesture that was unmistakably protective. His full alpha presence rolled out like a wave, pressure and power that made wolves throughout the chamber drop their eyes in instinctive submission. Deborah is my mate, he said, each word falling like a hammer strike. Anyone who touches her answers to me personally, not to the council, not to pack law, to me. Silence stretched thick and heavy. I watched wolves shift in their seats, exchange glances that said they understood exactly what he was promising. Violence, swift and absolute. Now, Oliver continued, his voice dropping to something quieter and infinitely more dangerous. Let's discuss the real issue. He turned slowly, making eye contact with as many wolves as would meet his gaze. 3 trained assassins infiltrated the Lunar Council. They bypassed security, positioned themselves perfectly, moved with coordination that speaks to significant planning and resources. He paused, letting implications settle. And they weren't targeting me. They were targeting an insignificant Omega from a fallen pack. A half-breed with no power, no allies, no reason to threaten anyone. I saw it then, subtle tension in shoulders here, careful blankness of expression there. Wolves who knew something, or suspected, and were working very hard not to show it. So tell me, Oliver said, his voice carrying absolute authority and barely leashed fury. Why assassins targeted her specifically. His gaze swept across assembled faces. Because someone in this room knows. The silence that followed wasn't submission. It was calculation. Every wolf measuring what they stood to lose by speaking against what they'd gain by staying silent. And that told me everything I needed to know about how deep this conspiracy ran. Marcus brought me to Oliver's study 3 days after the council session, his expression unreadable, but his posture tense in a way that made my stomach clench. The king needs to see you, he said, then added more gently when he saw my face pale. It's not a summons. He needs your help. The study was nothing like the grand chambers I'd woken in that first night. This room was functional, almost Spartan, with maps covering every available surface and documents stacked in precarious towers that spoke of sleepless nights and obsessive focus. The desk had disappeared beneath layers of parchment, some marked with red ink that looked angry even from across the room. Oliver stood at the center of organized chaos, his dark hair tied back, shadows under his eyes that said he hadn't been sleeping any better than I had. When he looked up and saw me, something in his expression softened fractionally. The assassins were hired by a contact within the court, Marcus explained without waiting for pleasantries, moving to a map that showed territories surrounding the capital. We traced the payment through 3 intermediaries, but the trail ends at someone with access to royal funds. He tapped a stack of documents. The contract specified you by name and appearance: pale blonde hair, blue eyes, thornwood pack markings. This wasn't random, Deborah. Someone wanted you specifically. The words should have terrified me. Instead, they settled with the weight of confirmation, an answer to a question I'd been afraid to ask. I'd known, somewhere deep and animal, that this wasn't chance. Oliver gestured to a chair near the desk. Sit. We need to understand why you're a target. What you know, what you've seen, anything that might make you dangerous to someone. So I told them. Everything I could remember about the months leading up to my pack's collapse, about the plague that had swept through Thornwood territory with unnatural speed, claiming lives faster than any disease should. Oliver questioned me for hours, his focus absolute, pulling details I didn't realize I remembered. Dates, symptoms, the order people fell sick, who died first, and who lasted longest. My mother taught me to recognize toxins, I said slowly, the memory surfacing reluctantly. She was a human healer before bonding with my father, had studied under physicians in human cities, learned things most wolves dismiss as weak human knowledge. My throat tightened. When the plague hit our pack, I tried to save them, used everything she'd taught me, but the symptoms didn't match any natural disease I'd learned about. Oliver had gone very still, that particular stillness that meant his mind was racing even as his body stayed locked. Marcus leaned forward, his expression sharpening. You suspected poison? Oliver asked, his voice carefully neutral in a way that made the question feel heavier than it should. I suspected, I admitted, the confession feeling like betrayal even now. But I had no proof. And everyone, the healers who came from neighboring packs, the council representatives who documented deaths, they all said the same thing. My voice cracked despite my best efforts. Divine punishment for tainted bloodlines. Proof that half-human wolves were weakness, contamination that nature itself was purging. The words tasted like ash. I'd believed them eventually, had to, because the alternative was too horrifying. I watched my entire pack die believing they deserved it, I whispered. Grief I'd kept locked away for 6 months surging up. My father, my cousins, children who'd never done anything wrong except be born to the wrong bloodline, and they died thinking the gods had judged them unworthy. Oliver's hand found mine across the desk, his fingers closing around my trembling ones with surprising gentleness. His palm was rough with calluses earned from holding weapons, but the touch was careful, as if he understood how close I was to breaking. What if they didn't deserve it? He said quietly, his dark eyes holding mine with intensity that demanded I hear him. What if someone engineered that plague specifically to eliminate half-human wolves? Made it look like disease so no one would investigate? So survivors would be too broken by grief and shame to question? And that is prost example deeded, of virus. The implications hit like a physical blow, stealing air from my lungs. My mind raced backward, re-examining everything I'd accepted as truth. The speed of deaths, the way it only affected wolves with human heritage, the convenient narrative that let purebloods feel righteous instead of alarmed. That's why they want me dead, I said, realization settling with terrible clarity. I'm the only survivor who might recognize the poison, who has the training to identify it as engineered rather than natural. My hands clenched into fists. If I'd spoken up 6 months ago, if I'd challenged the divine punishment narrative, you'd be dead, Marcus interrupted bluntly. They sent 3 assassins after you at the Lunar Council, in front of witnesses, knowing it would raise questions. Imagine what they'd have done if you were alone in Thornwood territory with no one watching. Oliver's thumb traced across my knuckles, a gesture so absent I wasn't sure he realized he was doing it. We prove it, he said, his voice carrying steel of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be swayed. We prove the plague was poison, trace it back to whoever ordered it, and make them answer for genocide. The word hung in the air between us, sharp and undeniable. Not just murder, genocide. Systematic elimination of an entire bloodline, and I was the one they'd failed to eliminate. I found the garden by accident, 2 nights after the investigation began, following a corridor that twisted deeper into the castle than I'd explored before. The door at the end opened onto moonlight and the scent of night-blooming flowers. a pocket of peace carved into stone walls that had seen centuries of violence. I thought I was alone until I saw him standing at the far edge, silhouetted against mountains that rose like teeth against the star-scattered sky. Oliver didn't turn when I entered, but his shoulders tensed slightly, acknowledging my presence even as he kept his gaze fixed on the horizon. I should have left, given him the privacy he clearly sought. Instead, I found myself walking forward, drawn by something I didn't have words for: the bone-deep exhaustion in the line of his spine, maybe, or the loneliness that radiated from him like cold from winter stone. "They murdered my family," I said into the silence, the words escaping before I could cage them. My voice cracked on the last word, grief and rage tangling until I couldn't separate one from the other, and I believed the lie that they deserved it, that their blood was wrong, that nature itself was correcting a mistake. Oliver turned then, and moonlight caught his face, revealing shadows under his eyes and something raw in his expression that he usually kept hidden beneath layers of control. He moved to the stone bench near where I stood and sat, leaving space beside him that felt like invitation rather than command. I sat, keeping careful distance between us, even though everything in me wanted to collapse against something solid and let someone else carry the weight for a while. The bench was cold through my dress, grounding me. When my thoughts threatened to spiral into darkness, I might not climb back out of. "My grandmother was half human," Oliver said into the darkness, his voice low and carefully controlled. The confession landed between us like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward even as I struggled to process what I'd heard. My grandfather fell in love with her in a human settlement, bonded with her in secret, and spent the rest of his life hiding what she was. My breath caught. I turned to stare at him, searching his profile for signs of deception and finding only grim honesty. "You're tainted by the same laws I've spent 15 years enforcing," he finished, bitterness seeping through despite his attempt at neutrality. "1/4 human blood, enough to make me exactly what Lady Morgana and her faction despise." His hands clenched into fists on his thighs, knuckles going white. "I built my entire rule on maintaining bloodline purity because I had to. If anyone discovered the truth, they'd use it to challenge my legitimacy, fracture the kingdom into civil war." The enormity of what he was telling me settled over my shoulders like a mantle I hadn't asked to wear. This wasn't just confession, it was vulnerability that could destroy him if I chose to weaponize it. And he was offering it freely, trusting me with ammunition that every enemy would kill to possess. "Then why save me?" I asked, the question barely more than a whisper. "Why bind yourself to someone who makes you vulnerable, who forces you to defend the very heritage you've spent years hiding?" Oliver finally looked at me fully, and the intensity in his dark eyes made my pulse stutter. "Because when I saw those assassins targeting you, I didn't just see someone in danger," he said, each word measured and deliberate. "I saw myself, alone, judged for heritage beyond my control, deemed unworthy by wolves too blind to see value beyond bloodline." His hand lifted, hovering near my face before settling against my cheek with devastating gentleness. The touch sent heat racing through me despite the cold air, his palm rough with warrior's calluses but careful, as if I were something precious, rather than broken. "I'd noticed you before," he continued, his thumb brushing along my cheekbone in an absent gesture that felt more intimate than anything I'd experienced. "Months ago, when you first arrived for preliminary councils, the way you stood at the edges, observing everything, absorbing cruelty directed at you without letting it break you." Something shifted in his expression, softening harsh lines into something almost vulnerable. "You carried loneliness the way I carried duty, like a weight you'd learned to balance so well you'd forgotten it was crushing you." My throat tightened, tears gathering despite my attempt to hold them back. No one had ever seen that, the careful construction I'd built to survive each day without collapsing under the weight of isolation and shame. "So saving me wasn't entirely selfless," I managed, trying to understand what he was offering, what this confession meant. "No," Oliver agreed, and there was relief in his voice at my understanding. "It was also selfish, also desperate, also an excuse to claim what I'd wanted but couldn't justify taking." His other hand found mine where it rested on the bench between us, fingers intertwining with surprising certainty. "When those assassins moved, I had a choice. Let events unfold naturally, or intervene in a way that would bind you to me permanently. And you chose to bind me," I said, the realization settling with strange warmth instead of the horror I should have felt. "I chose to stop being alone," he corrected quietly. "I chose to protect someone who deserved protection, who'd survived horrors I could barely imagine, and still had the strength to stand in rooms full of wolves who wanted her dead. He leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching mine, his breath warm against my lips. I chose you, Deborah, not just because you needed saving, but because I needed someone real in a world of carefully constructed lies. The kiss, when it came, tasted like confession and desperation, and everything neither of us had let ourselves want. His lips moved against mine with controlled intensity, the kiss of someone who'd denied himself connection for so long that, given permission, he couldn't quite hold back the need. My hands found his shoulders, feeling tension coiled beneath leather and muscle, and I kissed him back with equal hunger, equal relief at finally being seen by someone who understood what loneliness cost. We were still catching our breath, foreheads pressed together and hearts racing, when rapid footsteps echoed through the garden entrance. Marcus appeared, his expression grim and urgent in a way that made my stomach drop. "My king," he said, slightly breathless from running. "Lady Morgana has called an emergency council session. She claims to have evidence that involves Deborah directly." His eyes met mine with something close to apology. "You're both summoned immediately." Oliver's hand tightened on mine, his jaw clenching with barely contained fury. But when he stood and pulled me to my feet, his touch remained gentle, protective, promising without words that whatever came next, I wouldn't face it alone. The council chamber felt different at midnight, shadows pooling in corners where torchlight couldn't reach, making the carved wolves on the walls seem like they were moving when I wasn't looking directly at them. Lady Morgana stood at the center of the floor, positioned in a circle of light that made her crimson dress gleam like fresh blood, her expression carefully arranged into righteous triumph. In her hands, she held documents sealed with wax that bore a crest I recognized with sickening clarity: Thornwood Pack's sigil, the twisted oak and crescent moon that I'd seen stamped on every official communication my father had ever sent. "I bring evidence," Morgana announced, her voice carrying that cultured poison I'd learned to recognize, that proves what many of us have suspected since the king made his unfortunate bonding decision. Her gaze slid to me with calculated disdain. Correspondence between Deborah Thornwood and the leader of the assassins who attacked the Lunar Council. The words hit like ice water down my spine. Around the chamber, wolves leaned forward, their expressions shifting from tired annoyance at the midnight summons to sharp, predatory interest. "These letters," Morgana continued, holding the documents up so everyone could see the seals, "detail a plan to orchestrate an assassination attempt that the half-breed could conveniently save the king from, forcing him into a bonding he would otherwise never consider." She smiled, all teeth and cruelty. A desperate Omega, using forbidden tactics to trap herself a king. My mouth went dry. I tried to speak, to deny, but my voice had abandoned me somewhere between hearing my pack's name and watching wolves nod in agreement, as if this confirmed suspicions they'd been nursing all along. Oliver's hand found mine on the armrest of my throne, his fingers intertwining with enough pressure to ground me, to remind me to breathe. "These documents," he said, his voice carrying cold authority. "Where did you obtain them?" "They were discovered in the assassin's belongings during investigation," Morgana said smoothly, "hidden in a false compartment that your own guards missed in their initial search." The implication was clear. Oliver's people were either incompetent or complicit. I had them authenticated by 3 separate document specialists. The seals are genuine Thornwood Pack, and the handwriting matches samples we have of Deborah's writing from her arrival registration. I found my voice, though it came out rougher than I wanted. "Those are forgeries. My pack died 6 months ago. I couldn't have corresponded with anyone using our seal after." "Unless you forged your pack's death," Morgana interrupted, her tone gentle in a way that made the accusation more damning. "Used forbidden magic to create the illusion of plague, while keeping resources and contacts alive to help you infiltrate royal circles." She turned to address the broader council. "It's not unprecedented for desperate Omegas to use dark arts when conventional means fail them." Murmurs rippled through the assembled wolves, agreement mixing with fascination at the scandal unfolding before them. I saw calculation in their eyes, wolves measuring how this would affect their own alliances, whether supporting or condemning me would benefit their positions. Oliver stood, and the movement pulled every gaze to him. His face was carved in ice, expression unreadable in a way that terrified me more than Morgana's accusations. He was calculating, assessing, and I realized with sinking horror that he had to at least appear to consider the possibility I'd manipulated him. Anything less would make him look weak, compromised. "Deborah," he said, and there was something in his voice that made my chest tight. "Did you have any knowledge of these letters? Any communication with the assassins before the attack? The question felt like betrayal, even though I understood its necessity. He had to ask publicly. Had to show the council he wasn't blinded by whatever bond we'd formed. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. No, I said, forcing myself to hold his gaze, even though everything in me wanted to look away. I've never seen those documents before. I didn't orchestrate anything. She would say that, Morgana interjected, before Oliver could respond. What else can she claim? Admitting guilt means execution. Marcus, Oliver said without taking his eyes off me. Examine those documents. Marcus descended from his position near the door, taking the papers from Morgana's hands with careful precision. The chamber fell silent, except for the soft rustle of parchment as he studied them under the nearest torch, his expression intense with concentration. Minutes stretched like hours. I watched Marcus's face, desperate for any sign that he'd found something, anything that would prove these were lies. Oliver's hand remained wrapped around mine, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of my hand in a gesture so subtle I wasn't sure anyone else could see it. Finally, Marcus looked up, and something in his expression made hope flare in my chest. The seals are wrong, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. They use simplified heraldry. The oak has 7 branches instead of 9, and the crescent moon is oriented incorrectly. He held the documents up so others could see. This is Thornwood Pack's crest from 3 generations ago, before they reformed their sigil. Current documents would show the updated version. I felt Oliver's hand tighten on mine fractionally, relief bleeding through his controlled exterior. Additionally, Marcus continued, moving to stand beside Oliver's throne, the ink is modern blend, northern production, specifically. Thornwood Pack territory wouldn't have had access to this particular formulation. His eyes locked on Morgana with sudden intensity. But the Royal Archives would. Anyone with access to old records and modern forging techniques could have created these. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Morgana's face paled slightly, her careful composure cracking at the edges. Someone wanted us to believe these were real, Marcus said slowly, deliberately. Someone with detailed knowledge of historical pack records and access to royal resources. He paused. Someone from the archives themselves. Oliver stood, his alpha presence filling the chamber with pressure that made wolves throughout the tiers shift uncomfortably. Lady Morgana, he said, his voice carrying lethal quiet. Your family oversees the royal archives. Care to explain how forged documents using outdated records from your own collections ended up in assassins' belongings? Morgana's eyes widened, genuine shock breaking through her cultured mask. This isn't someone must have. Guards, Oliver commanded, and 4 wolves moved forward from positions along the walls. Detain Lady Morgana pending investigation into conspiracy and attempted frame of the Queen. The title Queen echoed through the chamber, and I realized he'd just publicly elevated my status from claimed mate to recognized monarch, making me untouchable in a way that even Morgana's faction couldn't easily dismiss. As guards surrounded Morgana, her composure finally shattered. You're choosing her over centuries of tradition, she spat, her cultured voice cracking into raw fury. Over bloodline purity, over everything that makes us strong. Oliver's expression didn't change. I'm choosing truth over convenient lies. Take her. As they escorted Morgana from the chamber, her eyes found mine, and the hatred in them was so pure it stole my breath. This wasn't over, her expression promised. This was only beginning, but for now, I was still breathing, still sitting in the Queen's throne beside a king who'd just risked everything to defend me. And that had to be enough. The investigation consumed the next 3 days like wildfire through dry timber, spreading faster and burning hotter than anyone had anticipated. I watched from the edges of Oliver's study as Marcus and his team brought in report after report, each one adding another piece to a puzzle that grew more horrifying with every revelation. Oliver hadn't slept, as far as I could tell. He stood at the center of his organized chaos, maps marked with red ink spreading across territories I'd never heard of, documents stacked in towers that threatened to topple with every passing breeze from the open windows. His dark hair had come loose from its tie, and shadows carved hollows beneath his eyes that made him look older, haunted by what he was uncovering. 12 packs, Marcus said, placing another file on the already groaning desk. His voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the anger vibrating beneath like a plucked string. 12 packs with documented half-human members. All suffered the same plague over the past 3 years. I moved closer despite myself, drawn by a sick fascination that made my stomach clench. The maps showed territories scattered across the kingdom, some bordering each other, others separated by hundreds of miles. But they all had one thing in common: red X marks where packs had fallen. The symptoms were identical, Marcus continued, pulling out medical reports that made my breath catch. I recognized my own mother's precise handwriting on one of them, notes she'd sent to neighboring healers before the plague had taken her too. Fever, seizures, internal bleeding, progressing too fast to be natural disease, but the council representatives who documented each outbreak attributed it to divine punishment for tainted bloodlines, I finished, my voice barely more than a whisper. The words tasted like ash, like betrayal. That's what they told us. What we believed, because questioning it meant admitting something worse. Oliver's eyes found mine across the desk, and I saw my own horror reflected back at me. The plague stopped 6 months ago, he said quietly. Right when your pack fell. Right when you became the last survivor. The implications hit me like a physical blow. They stopped because I was supposed to die with the others, I said, understanding crystallizing with terrible clarity. But I survived, and they realized they'd left a witness. Someone with medical training who might eventually recognize the symptoms as poison. Marcus nodded grimly. We found lab records, he said, pulling out documents that made Oliver's jaw clench. Facility in the northern mountains, tucked away where no one would think to look. They were engineering the poison specifically to target wolves with human heritage. Something in the chemical composition reacts to genetic markers that purebloods don't carry. My legs went weak. I sank into the nearest chair, my mind struggling to process the scale of what they were describing. Not just murder. Not even mass murder. Systematic elimination of everyone like me, designed to look like nature correcting a mistake. How many dead? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Hundreds, Oliver said, his voice carrying a weight that made the word feel heavier than it should. Maybe more. Some packs were completely eliminated before anyone thought to document numbers. Others lost only their half-human members, which most pureblood leaders saw as unfortunate but not worth investigating. I thought about my father, my cousins, children who'd played in thornwood forests without knowing someone had decided they weren't worthy of existence. Rage built in my chest, hot and vicious and demanding outlet. Who? The question came out rough, scraped raw by grief and fury tangled too tightly to separate. Who ordered this? Who decided we deserved to die? Marcus and Oliver exchanged glances, and I saw something pass between them that made my stomach drop. Oliver moved around the desk, coming to kneel beside my chair so we were at eye level. His hands found mine, holding them with gentle strength. The lab records show regular payments from an account controlled by the Pure Blood Preservation Society, he said carefully, watching my face. A faction within the council that's been operating for decades, dedicated to maintaining bloodline purity through any means necessary. Lady Morgana, I breathed, pieces clicking together. Morgana was part of it, Oliver confirmed. But she wasn't the architect. The society is larger, more organized than we initially believed. They've been systematically eliminating half-human wolves for years, hiding it behind religious justification and medical ignorance. He paused, his dark eyes boring into mine with intensity that demanded I understand what he was about to say. They planned to eliminate you next, but when that failed at the Lunar Council, when I claimed you publicly, they shifted tactics, tried to discredit you, frame you as manipulator so your execution would look like justice rather than murder. And if that failed? I asked, though I could already guess the answer. They'd come for me, Oliver said simply. Remove the one king strong enough to stop them, trigger succession crisis, use the chaos to seize power, and continue their genocide without interference. The scope of it staggered me. This wasn't just about me, about my pack. This was about reshaping the entire kingdom according to their vision of purity, eliminating anyone who didn't fit. We have to stop them, I said, and was surprised by the steel in my own voice. We have to expose this before the full council, make them answer for what they've done. Oliver's hand cupped my face, his thumb brushing away tears I hadn't realized were falling. That will put you directly in their crosshairs, he said quietly. They'll do everything in their power to silence you before you can testify. They already want me dead, I pointed out, covering his hand with mine. At least this way, I'll take them down with me. Something shifted in Oliver's expression, pride, maybe, or recognition of the same reckless courage that had made me attack armed assassins with a champagne bottle. Then we do this together, he said. We prove the genocide, trace it back to every member of their society, and make them answer for hundreds of murders. Marcus cleared his throat, drawing our attention back to the desk covered in evidence. "There's one more thing," he said, his expression grave. "The society kept detailed records of their targets, future plans for expansion." He pulled out a list that made my blood run cold. They weren't done. They were planning to extend the plague to mixed-blood wolves in human settlements next. Thousands of potential targets. Oliver stood, his alpha presence filling the room with barely contained fury. "Call an emergency council session," he commanded. "Every pack leader, every alpha with voting authority. I want them all present." His eyes met mine. "It's time to end this." I nodded, standing on legs that felt steadier than they had minutes ago. Fear still coursed through me, but it was joined now by purpose, by the bone-deep certainty that my survival hadn't been accident or luck. I'd lived for a reason, to be the voice for hundreds who couldn't speak anymore, to expose the lie that had justified their murders, and I wouldn't fail them. The council chamber had never felt more like a coliseum than it did in this moment, with every seat filled and hundreds of eyes tracking my movement as I descended the stone steps toward the center floor. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought everyone must hear it, but I kept my spine straight and my chin up the way my father had taught me before he'd died, believing himself unworthy. I would not die believing that lie. Lady Morgana stood at the opposite side of the circular floor, flanked by guards but somehow still radiating authority despite her detention. She'd invoked her right to formal bloodline challenge, an ancient law that allowed accused nobles to defend themselves before the full council, to present counter-evidence, and demand judgment from their peers, rather than the king alone. It was a clever move, forcing Oliver to allow public trial when a quiet execution would have been cleaner. But it also gave me something I needed, an audience that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Oliver sat on his throne above us, his expression carved in ice, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the armrests with enough force to make the carved wood creak. Marcus stood at his right hand, arms full of documents and evidence we'd spent days gathering. The medical reports, the lab records, the lists of the dead. "This council convenes to hear formal challenge," Oliver announced, his voice carrying absolute authority through the chamber. "Lady Morgana stands accused of conspiracy to commit genocide, forgery of royal documents, and treason against the crown. She has invoked her right to present defense." Morgana stepped forward with cultured grace, as if she were attending a formal dinner rather than defending herself against execution. "I present no defense," she said, and shock rippled through the assembled wolves. "Because I have committed no crime. I have done only what was necessary to preserve the strength and purity of our bloodlines, to prevent the contamination that weakens us." Her eyes found mine across the floor, cold and certain. "The half-breeds who died were nature's mistake, and we simply hastened what should have happened naturally. There is no crime in eliminating weakness." The casual cruelty of her words, the complete absence of remorse, made rage build in my chest, like pressure behind a dam. Around the chamber, I saw wolves nodding in agreement, their expressions suggesting Morgana had just voiced what they'd been thinking all along. "You murdered hundreds," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to control it. "Children, families, entire packs. You engineered poison specifically to target people whose only crime was being born to parents who loved across bloodline boundaries." "I preserved purity," Morgana countered smoothly. "I protected our species from the dilution that would eventually destroy us. Your mother was human, Deborah. Your blood carries weakness that shouldn't be passed to future generations." She turned to address the broader council. "The king has been compromised by misguided compassion. He's allowed this half-breed to manipulate him into defending the very contamination we should be eliminating." Murmurs of agreement grew louder. I saw it happening in real time, the narrative shifting. Wolves who'd been horrified by genocide suddenly reconsidering whether it might be justified after all. "The Thornwood Pack plague wasn't divine punishment," I said, forcing my voice to carry clearly through the rising noise. "It was engineered poison. I have the medical records to prove it." I gestured to Marcus, who began distributing copies of my mother's documentation to the council tiers. My mother was a trained healer. She recognized symptoms that didn't match any natural disease: rapid progression, internal hemorrhaging, neurological damage that only affected wolves with human heritage markers. I moved through the center floor, making eye contact with as many wolves as would meet my gaze. She sent reports to neighboring healers, documented everything, tried to warn others that something was wrong. And she was ignored because the convenient explanation was that we deserved it. "Your mother was human," Morgana interrupted. Her medical knowledge means nothing against centuries of understanding about bloodline purity. Her medical knowledge, I said, turning to face Morgana directly, is the only reason I can prove what you've done. I pulled out the toxicology report Marcus had helped me prepare, the chemical analysis that had taken 3 days to complete. The compound used in the poison is synthetic. It doesn't occur naturally. It was specifically designed to target genetic markers that only exist in wolves with human ancestry. I held the document up so the entire council could see. This isn't nature correcting a mistake. This is murder, premeditated and systematic, designed to look like divine judgment so no one would question it. Oliver leaned forward in his throne. Marcus, present the lab records. Marcus stepped forward with documents bearing official seals. We traced the poison's origin to a facility in the northern mountains, he announced. Lab records show regular payments from the Pure Blood Preservation Society dating back 12 years. They've been refining the compound, testing it, then deploying it systematically across territories with mixed blood populations. He distributed copies throughout the tiers. 12 packs over 3 years, hundreds dead, all made to look like natural plague or divine punishment. His voice hardened. This wasn't preservation. This was genocide. The chamber erupted into chaos. Some wolves stood in outrage at the evidence before them. Others argued that the deaths were still justified regardless of method. Alphas shouted over each other, alliances fracturing in real time as the scope of the conspiracy became undeniable. Through it all, Morgana remained perfectly calm. Yes, she said simply, her voice cutting through the noise. We did it. We eliminated weakness. And given the chance, I would do it again. She turned slowly, addressing the full council with absolute certainty. Some of you supported our efforts. Provided funding, resources, protection. You know who you are. Silence fell like a hammer. I watched wolves throughout the tiers shift uncomfortably, faces paling as they realized Morgana was threatening to expose everyone involved. And others, she continued, turned blind eyes when plagues conveniently eliminated problem populations from your territories. You didn't order the deaths, but you certainly didn't mourn them. Her smile was cold. We're all complicit here. The only difference is I have the courage to admit it. Oliver stood, his alpha presence filling the chamber with pressure that made even the strongest alphas drop their eyes. Anyone who participated in, funded, or knowingly ignored this genocide will be identified and punished, he declared. This ends now. Does it? Morgana asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her tone. You've bonded with a half-breed, Oliver, publicly claimed her as your queen. How long before your own bloodline is questioned? How long before wolves refuse to acknowledge heirs carrying human contamination? She gestured to me with dismissive elegance. You think saving her makes you noble, but all you've done is weaken your throne and given your enemies the ammunition they need to destroy you. Oliver descended from his throne, moving with predatory grace until he stood beside me on the floor. His hand found mine, intertwining our fingers in full view of 200 witnesses. My grandmother was half human, he said, and the confession rippled through the chamber like an earthquake, which makes me exactly what your society has been trying to eliminate. Shocked silence, then chaos as wolves erupted with questions, accusations, demands for proof. Oliver's voice cut through it all. I've spent 15 years enforcing bloodline purity laws to hide that truth. Condemned others for the heritage I carried in secret. His hand tightened on mine. But I'm done hiding. Done pretending that blood purity matters more than character, that heritage determines worth. He turned to face the full council. Deborah's half-human blood didn't make her weak. It gave her the medical knowledge to recognize poison where everyone else saw divine judgment. It gave her the courage to stand in this chamber and expose conspiracy while knowing you all wanted her dead. His alpha presence intensified. That's not weakness. That's exactly the kind of strength we need. You're condemning your own rule, Morgana said, almost pitying. Half the council will never accept a tainted king and his half-breed queen. Then they can leave, Oliver said simply. Anyone who can't accept that strength comes from character rather than bloodline purity has no place in my kingdom. The challenge hung in the air. I watched wolves throughout the tiers make calculations, weighing loyalty against prejudice, power against principle. Some stood and walked out, their departure a clear statement of where they stood. Others remained, their expressions ranging from reluctant acceptance to genuine support. When the exodus ended, roughly half the council remained. Lady Morgana, Oliver announced, You are found guilty of genocide, conspiracy, and treason. The sentence is death." He gestured to guards. "Take her." As they moved to seize her, Morgana's eyes found mine one last time. "You think you've won," she said quietly. "Meant only for me. But you've just painted a target on every half-blood in this kingdom. We tried to eliminate you quietly. Now they'll come for you loudly, and there won't be enough guards in the world to stop them." The threat chilled my blood, but I forced myself to hold her gaze. "Let them come," I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice. "At least they'll be honest about their hatred instead of hiding behind divine justification." Morgana laughed, a sound without humor. "You're braver than I gave you credit for, half-breed. It's a shame you won't live long enough to see whether your courage matters." Then the guards dragged her away, and I was left standing in a chamber half-empty but still full of wolves who would have preferred I'd died with my pack. Oliver's arm came around my waist, steady and warm. "You did it," he murmured against my ear. "You exposed them." "We exposed them," I corrected, leaning into his strength because my own legs were threatening to give out now that the adrenaline was crashing. "And Morgana's right. I've just made myself a target for every pure-blood supremacist left." "Then we deal with them together," Oliver said firmly. "No more hiding, no more pretending. We face this as partners." I looked up at him, seeing exhaustion and determination in equal measure. "Partners," I agreed, "even when it's terrifying." "Especially when it's terrifying," he corrected, and despite everything, I found myself smiling. 3 months passed in a blur of reconstruction and resistance. The council reformed around us, new members appointed to replace those who'd walked out or been implicated in the genocide conspiracy. 3 of the new appointees were half-human wolves who'd been hiding their heritage for years, afraid of the very persecution we'd just exposed. Watching them take seats in chambers that had once condemned their existence felt like watching justice finally catch up to reality. But Morgana's prediction had proven accurate. Death threats arrived weekly, slipped under doors or left in places I'd been moments before. 2 assassination attempts had been thwarted by Marcus's guards, both targeting me specifically. Oliver had responded by increasing security to suffocating levels. I couldn't walk from my chambers to the garden without 6 guards tracking my every movement. It should have felt like protection. Mostly it felt like living in a beautiful cage. I stood now in the same hall where everything had begun, where Oliver had whispered, "You're in danger. Pretend I'm your husband," and changed my entire world with 5 words. The summit had concluded. Most packs had returned to their territories to implement the new bloodline reforms Oliver had mandated. Laws protecting mixed-blood wolves, criminalizing discrimination, requiring investigation of any suspicious illness affecting heritage-mixed populations. Half the kingdom supported the changes, the other half was actively working to undermine them. "Do you have regrets?" Oliver asked, his hand finding mine as we watched the last delegates prepare for departure. The hall was quieter now, emptier, echoing with memories of chaos and blood and the moment my invisibility had shattered forever. I considered the question seriously, weighing the terror and exhaustion against everything I'd become. "I regret the deaths," I said finally. "I regret that it took genocide for anyone to care about half-human wolves. I regret that my pack died believing they deserved it." Oliver's thumb traced circles on the back of my hand, a gesture that had become familiar comfort. "But I don't regret surviving," I continued. "I don't regret standing in that council chamber and forcing them to see what they'd ignored. And I don't regret you." I turned to face him fully, taking in the changes 3 months had wrought. The shadows under his eyes had lessened. He smiled more now, genuine warmth breaking through ice that had once seemed permanent. "Even though staying means living with constant danger?" he asked quietly. "Even though half the kingdom wants you dead and the other half tolerates you at best?" "Even then," I confirmed, "because being invisible killed me slowly, and I'd rather face hatred while standing beside someone who sees my worth than hide safely while pretending I don't exist." Something shifted in Oliver's expression, vulnerability breaking through his usual control. "I need to confess something," he said, and the seriousness in his tone made my stomach clench. "What?" I asked, bracing for whatever revelation would come. "That night in the hall, when I whispered you were in danger," Oliver began, his dark eyes holding mine with uncomfortable intensity. "I saw the assassins. Yes, I recognized the threat, but I'd been watching you for months before that, wanting you but unable to justify claiming someone so inappropriate for a king." His hand cupped my face with devastating gentleness. "When I saw those assassins moving toward you, part of me was genuinely protecting you from immediate danger. But part of me, He paused. As if the confession cost him, part of me was seizing an excuse to claim what I'd wanted all along. My breath caught. So, I wasn't just someone you saved, I said slowly, understanding crystallizing. I was someone you chose. You were always choice, Oliver said fiercely. The danger gave me justification to make that choice publicly, to use an ancient bonding law that would make you untouchable. But I wasn't being entirely selfless, Deborah. I was also being selfish, desperate, seizing the opportunity to bind you to me in a way that couldn't be easily broken. Tears gathered in my eyes, but this time they were different than the grief and fear I'd carried for months. These were relief, understanding, the bone-deep recognition that I hadn't been obligation or burden. Why didn't you tell me before? I asked. Because I needed you to choose too, Oliver said simply. Not because ancient law bound you, not because you owed me for protection, but because you wanted this, wanted me, even knowing what it would cost. His forehead pressed against mine. I needed to know you'd stay not from duty but from choice. I choose you, I said, the words coming easier than I'd expected. I choose this, even when it's terrifying and dangerous and complicated beyond anything I imagined. My hands found his face, feeling the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor that said this vulnerability cost him more than any battle ever had. I choose us. The kiss tasted like promises and future and everything we'd fought to build from the wreckage of conspiracy and genocide. His lips moved against mine with controlled intensity, and I kissed him back with equal certainty, equal commitment to whatever came next. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and hearts racing, the hall felt different. Not threatening anymore, but full of possibility. I have something for you, Oliver said, reaching into his jacket to pull out a small box carved with wolves running beneath a full moon. He opened it to reveal a ring, simple silver band etched with symbols that made my breath catch. Thornwood Pack's crest, I whispered, recognizing the twisted oak and crescent moon. But updated, not the historical version. I had it commissioned, Oliver explained. So you'd never forget where you came from, who you survived for. He slid the ring onto my finger with careful precision. And so everyone who sees it knows, you're not just my mate by ancient law. You're my queen by choice, carrying the heritage they tried to eliminate. I stared at the ring through tears that blurred my vision. My pack symbol, carried forward into a future they'd never lived to see. Thank you, I managed, my voice breaking. Oliver pulled me close, his arms wrapping around me with strength tempered by tenderness. We're going to face more attacks, he said quietly against my hair. More conspiracies, more wolves who can't accept what we're building. The threats won't stop just because we exposed one faction. I know, I said, settling into his embrace. But we face them together. No more isolation, no more carrying weight alone. Together, Oliver agreed. Even when I'm being an overprotective king who assigns too many guards. I laughed despite everything. Especially then, though we might need to negotiate the guard situation. Not negotiable, he said firmly, but I could hear the smile in his voice. Marcus approached from across the hall, his expression carefully neutral, but eyes showing approval he'd never voice aloud. My king, my queen, he said formally. The last delegates have departed. The hall is yours. Oliver nodded dismissal, and Marcus retreated with a slight bow. When we were alone again, Oliver turned me to face the empty hall, the space that had held hundreds of witnesses to my forced bonding and subsequent transformation. This is where it started, he said. Where I claimed you in front of everyone, where you went from invisible to unavoidable. Where 3 assassins tried to kill me, and you turned into my shield, I added. Where everything changed in heartbeats. Do you remember what I said? Oliver asked. When I first pulled you close? You're in danger, I recited. Pretend I'm your husband. I should have said something different, Oliver murmured, turning me to face him fully. I should have said, you're extraordinary. Be my partner. Not just for this moment, but for everything that comes after. My throat tightened with emotion. You can say it now, I managed. Oliver's smile was genuine, transforming his face from harsh angles to something almost gentle. You're extraordinary, Deborah Thornwood, he said clearly. Be my partner. Not because ancient law bound us, not because danger forced my hand, but because I choose you and you choose me, and together we're stronger than anything trying to break us. Yes, I said simply. Yes to all of it. The danger, the partnership, the choice to keep choosing each other when walking away would be easier. As sunset painted the mountains beyond the windows in shades of gold and amber, I realized the real story had never been about the dramatic rescue or the political intrigue. It had been about this, the quiet, steady choice to keep choosing each other despite everything working against us. From invisible Omega to essential queen. From isolated king to partner who ruled with heart. From believing ourselves unworthy to knowing we were chosen. That was the transformation that mattered. Not the title, or the power, or the reforms we'd fought to implement, but the simple, revolutionary act of two lonely people deciding they didn't have to be lonely anymore. No regrets, I said again, meaning it more than ever. Oliver's arm tightened around my waist. No regrets, he agreed, though I reserve the right to complain when politics gets tedious. I laughed, the sound echoing through the empty hall. That's fair. I reserve the right to complain about excessive security. Still not negotiable, he said, but he was smiling now, genuine and warm. As we left the hall together, walking toward whatever challenges awaited us, I felt the weight of my pack's ring on my finger, a reminder of who I'd survived for, who I'd become. And for the first time since the plague had taken everything, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be, chosen, protected, loved, not despite my heritage, but including every part of who I was. That was worth fighting for. Worth facing whatever came next, together.